Thank you very much. We now have with us Mr. J.R. Bernalty and the Chair of the Utilities and Commerce Commission, Anthony Rendon. Do either of you want to make any opening remarks? Not at this time. You're welcome to make them later. Dr. Bushnell, I've introduced him already. He's been here before to give us briefings. And again, if you could keep it to 5 to 10 minutes.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity. I guess if the last talk we heard about sort of the forward-looking, I guess I'm the ghost of Christmas past and present. I was going to focus on what I could dig up in terms of actual numbers for what's happened in the state in terms of renewable expansion and costs up to this point in time, and because I think that's actually pretty informative about what we might expect going forward, especially the experience of the last couple of years. So I'll talk a little bit about quantities, and I'll talk a little bit about costs. There are different ways people have framed the issue of costs, and I just want to sort of put that in context, and then talk about the system management issues. I probably won't have time to talk about the big picture context, so we'll see. So this is just the utility scale in front of the meter generation in California, data that's easy for me to find. The expansion over the last 15 years, as we heard, we've already had a lot of biomass and geothermal production in the state for a long time. What we've seen in the last really 3 or 4 years as the RPS has really started to bite is this rapid expansion of wind and particularly utility scale solar that's just hitting the system. To put this in context, so we've doubled our output roughly over the last 15 years. If we want to think about this, this is my artist rendering of where a 33% and a 50% target would be. There's a bunch of assumptions you have to make to kind of calibrate that, but we're roughly a third of the way to where a 50% target would put us, and a little over half towards 33%. So we've doubled in the last 15 years, but there's a long way to go to get to these targets. The other way to think about the production that we've been adding to the system is by the time of day. We've sort of seen pictures like this already. This is the actual output in the California ISO system for April of 2013, broken out by a bunch of different renewables. Wind is in red and solar's in green. And this is the pattern we're kind of used to, where we've got the wind producing a little more in the evenings and late afternoons, and the solar, of course, during the daylight hours. What's really happened dramatically in the system just in the last couple of years is we've added a lot of solar capacity, and so fast forward 2 years to April of 2015, this is the average hourly output now. You can see the effect of all of the new solar capacity we've been adding, which is really concentrating a lot of the renewable production into these midday daylight hours. If we want to think about costs, luckily, or well, for whatever you want to view it, this is happening in a regulatory context, so there's a lot of documentation about what these contracts look like. I can't see a lot of that documentation, but there are reports put out by the PUC for the legislature and others. And the new contracts have cost about $75 a megawatt hour, or 7.5 cents a kilowatt hour. And if you look at just the average cost of all the energy we bought in 2014, it was about 10 cents a kilowatt hour, or $100 a megawatt hour. So the costs are going down. The new contracts are cheaper than what historically we've paid. There's a lot of diversity in terms of what we're paying for different types of production within that number of averages. But costs are going down. What we don't quite know is exactly what happens as we increase quantities at a given point in time, and if we start to run into scarcity of attractive locations or transmission accessible locations.
Can you tell me what the cost per megawatt hour is for, say, natural gas? Compare it with...
Yeah, sure. So that's part... It's sort of a nice segue to the next sort of look at cost, which is what we call the avoided cost, or the energy value of the power that we're buying through the RPS. And there's a couple ways people have looked at this. One is comparing the cost of the new contracts for renewable production with that of what it would cost to build and buy power from a new, say, natural gas plant. And it's about on par. So the cost of a new natural gas plant, the energy from a new natural gas plant, is in this range of 7.5 cents to 10 cents a kilowatt hour also. So to the extent that we would have to be buying power from some source, the RPS is not costing us and maybe is even saving us relative to purchases from a new thermal conventional plant. The issue is, to the extent to which we actually needed to buy a new power plant. We are putting this RPS into a system that was already resourced with an adequate amount of capacity and energy. There's been some things happening with San Onofre and some other issues, but to a large extent, the RPS energy we're adding is going on top of a system that already had enough capacity or sources of energy. And so that changes the view where the value of the energy, if we're buying just in the short term, is about 4.5 cents, $45 a megawatt hour, as opposed to the 7.5 cents or 10 cents a kilowatt hour that it would cost to build a whole new plant. So the perspective people have, I think, of compare that to, say, the CAFE standards, where we are encouraging people or requiring people to buy more fuel-efficient cars when they go out and buy a new car. What the RPS is doing is more equivalent to requiring people to replace their car with a more fuel-efficient car right away, rather than through the sort of cycle of turnover of the capital. It's more of a problem in electricity because the capital lasts a really long time. So there are these two ways to look at it, but to the extent we have enough energy and capacity and we're crowding out the old stuff, we have to think about the fact that as we add more and more renewable energy, probably the value that we're displacing is going to continue to go down. On top of that, we have the issue that not all megawatts, these numbers are averages over all hours, and not all megawatt hours are the same. And there's another interesting change that's just happened over the last couple of years in that regard. So this is the hour of day production of renewables, again, in the California ISO system. And I added this line that is the price in the day-ahead market in the California ISO. This is what we're used to seeing in the industry for 20 years, where there's a peak around 7, 8 p.m. and kind of a mini peak around midday where prices are high. But fast forward 2 years, and in April of 2015, with all of the added renewable capacity that's concentrated in the midday hours, in April of 2015, the cheapest time to buy electricity on average was 11 in the morning, not the middle of the night. And we can kind of expect this trend to continue because we will be adding more and more renewables that will be concentrated during this period. We're also already starting to see the formation of this sort of double peak on either side of the run up and run down of the solar capacity. And that's reflecting both the fact that the solar capacity isn't available during those times, but also that some thermal and other resources are having to be reconfigured a bit in order to manage the ramp up and ramp down of the other resources. So this is the kind of pattern we've expected. It's already being experienced to some extent, and we would expect this to become more pronounced as the penetration increases. All right, on integration issues, I am not an engineer. Well, actually, I am an engineer, but it's the wrong kind of engineer. So I can't really credibly say reliability will not be threatened. But my sense is that systems can manage these types of challenges. It's really a question of the cost of the resources needed to keep involuntary outages from happening to customers. And so to that extent, to echo the previous speaker, there are things we can do to try to mitigate the costs of these types of reliability integration issues. One would be a expansion or certainly integration with neighboring areas. In part, this helps absorb the shocks, sort of dissipate them over a broader area. And then, as we heard earlier, there is this issue of curtailments, which would be looming. Several studies have shown that there is a real risk of having to just turn off the renewable production absent a place to sell it to. So better integration allows us to sell it to neighbors rather than just curtail it. We shouldn't expect this to be a profitable exchange because probably the contract costs are going to be greater than the price of energy during those times that we're exporting it. But to the extent these contracts are take or pay, where we have to pay them whether we're curtailing them or not, it's better to get something for it than nothing. And then in terms of diversity, there's also this issue of, well, if we are trying to add more renewable capacity and to the extent we're running out of locations that are economic to site and access the network, then being able to find lower cost options elsewhere to the extent we're running out of those types of locations inside the state is an obvious way to try to reduce long-run costs. It also would help mitigate short-term shocks, sorry for this typo, to the extent that we've concentrated our renewables in narrow areas of the state, it makes them more vulnerable to weather events like cloud cover or the wind dying down. And to the extent we can spread that out over a broader area, it makes the system less vulnerable to local weather shocks that are affecting the output of the renewables. So geographic diversity is very helpful. I'll just sort of add that we have been importing power and exporting power to our neighbors for a long time. It just has happened in a rather kludgy form of interstate transactions that are managed on an hour-by-hour basis or in even longer term. And so one of the advantages of trying to integrate into a more ISO-like market structure is the ability to manage these types of fluctuations on a much shorter time horizon, which is particularly important for intermittent resources. They're the ones that have trouble managing any kinds of shocks on a shorter term type of time frame. All right, so just to finish, I'll just say renewables has been a big success story, I think, more than biofuels, maybe more than most energy efficiency programs. Renewables have been a very cost-effective way of reducing greenhouse gases. Going forward, I think we want to sort of ask ourselves whether success means sort of rigidly adhering to specific numerical targets or trying to come up with ways that are really ultimately demonstrating cost-effective ways of reducing carbon intensity that maintain reliability. And their flexibility in the where, when, what, and how helps to create a model that other jurisdictions are more likely to want to emulate. Thanks.
Thank you. Again, my two first speakers are right at 10 minutes, so thank you very much for being on time. Perhaps we could, well, let's see. We have two new members. Perhaps you'd like to make an opening statement?
I'm not going to make an opening statement, but thank you for holding this hearing and look forward to gathering information.
Absolutely. Audenberg?
I don't know that I need an opening statement either, but I appreciate your time and taking the time to discuss these issues with us. And obviously, we are I'm especially very, very interested in how we're going to handle whether it's storage or what our solutions are going to be for the flexibility of energy and renewables moving forward. So thank you for being here.
All right. So I think maybe that's our first question, which is, well, you've talked about geographical diversity, but you know, we probably aren't going any further than New Mexico or possibly Wyoming for wind, New Mexico for solar. It's only really a shift of about an hour or so. It would certainly help in the morning peak, but it certainly isn't going to be available in the earliest part of the morning peak. So I'm hoping that when the ISO comes up, they can give us a more quantitative answer to that. We know how to do storage at a relatively cost-effective way with pump storage, having two reservoirs and pumping water from a lower reservoir to an upper reservoir. But we don't have enough of those in the state. So perhaps either one of you are welcome to talk about what possible solutions could be. Don't both try to talk at once. Dr. Hart?
There was a lot in that question. I think with respect to geographic diversity, I think the big advantage of going to New Mexico or Wyoming is to find the good wind. It's got high capacity factors, and we're running out of high capacity factor resources in California, and there are a number of development challenges within California as well with wind. So there is quite a significant benefit for integrating out-of-state wind resources, and then the question is just, does that benefit justify the costs for transmission and things to bring that power into California? With respect to storage, pump storage does seem to be the most cost-effective technology today. But when we need it when we need more of it is still sort of an open question. So I think our work has shown that there might, if you don't get the regional coordination and you don't get the renewable diversity, and so we're basically just building all solar and trying to manage those fluctuations ourselves, that storage becomes pretty competitive, above 40% RPS, so maybe in the late 2020s from what we know so far. But the cost trajectories for batteries are still highly uncertain, and what you see, the public data versus the sort of claims for the future cost reductions don't align well, and so there's a lot of uncertainty with respect to batteries. It almost looks like you don't have the big siting challenges with batteries that you have with pump storage. They probably won't be a cost-effective solution for the big system-level integration challenges that we've been discussing today. There might be sort of niche applications for distributed systems where a system might benefit from storage, but it's not necessarily something you have to decide on right now, because for the system-level question, we don't need it yet. We might need it in about 10 years, and it's quick to get these systems integrated and onto the system. So that's at least one thing going for us with all the uncertainty.
I'll just add on that. In terms of the geographic diversity, you're right in the sense that there's limits to how much, on average, we can diversify the availability of different types of renewables. But also there's, within those averages, a diversity in terms of just availability on any given day. And so if there is a low wind or cloud cover hitting one part of the West, it's unlikely to be hitting other parts of the West. So diversity helps in terms of just managing the uncertainty within those averages. Although you're right, there are still challenges in terms of what we can expect on average. I'm not really the person who likes to forecast technology costs and what will be the right option 10 years from now. I think if we were doing this 10 years ago, solar photovoltaic at the utility scale would probably not be something we would be saying would be as attractive as it is today. So I'll give the stock economist answer of saying that we want to have a system that is able to adjust to whatever emerges as the most cost-effective technology. And it could be storage, but I think there probably is going to be a role still to play for thermal resources and conventional resources in terms of trying to either back up or balance the uncertain availability. And so I'll throw that into that mix.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Dolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I was noticing your chart that, first of all, not all renewables are created equal. And even though I like all different varieties of renewable, and I think there's a place for all of those, but we have incentivized by taxpayer dollars some of those renewables. Wind, solar fall into that category. So when you say that the price of those are getting less, it's still, there's a cost to the taxpayer or the ratepayer indirectly by those incentives that are placed upon those renewables. And then when you talk about, the battery, so large hydro is not included in renewables, but it is a great source of having the ability to turn on and off within minutes. And so if we expand our renewables, and right now by looking at one of the charts you had there, it's solar that seems to be driving the over generation at certain times of the day, and wind, I think, was the other one. What as a policymaker, we need to make policies not only to protect the ratepayer, to protect the environment, but also the taxpayer who's subsidizing those. And if we talk about California, where those are our constituents that we represent, and we are moving our energy out of state or buying energy from another state that is taking advantage of the ratepayers and the taxpayers in California, I'm trying to come to a conclusion where would we manage that in the most efficient way so that Californians that we represent get the best bang for their buck, do the right thing for the environment, but also not make other states wealthy off of our cheap power and our tax base that we're paying for. Now, that's a long question, I understand, but it's really the crux of, I think, where we head as policymakers in California to make the right decisions so that we can actually manage the portfolio in a way that, and I think there's a disconnect between the constituents that we represent on the reality that we have a lot of renewables in California right now that we can probably meet a higher demand than what's already been mandated. It's just a matter of getting the energy from one place to the other or time of day. Is there any thought process on how we would make it? I guess the crux of my question is how can we spread it out, save the money, and not make the ratepayers of California make other states an advantage over us in a competitive way. Does that make sense?
All right, so I think I'm on the hook for that one. So at a very high level, first of all, you're right that the prices I was quoting, are the contract costs, and so to the extent there are tax credits and other incentives in play, that is making the cost to the ratepayer lower, but it's coming perhaps from federal to some extent, or to a lesser extent local subsidies. So that was just the ratepayer expenses. On how we manage this in a way that that minimizes costs, I think we do want to the extent possible, focus on what the big picture goals are, which would be greenhouse gas reductions and to a lesser extent, specific renewable goals. But within those targets, try to allow for markets to play their role. The prices I was showing you are sort of telling us something about the relative value of different types of sources, and we can use those sorts of market instruments to really lead the way in terms of what the most cost-effective options are. It is to the extent that renewables are at least displacing existing capacity, there are going to be some costs. It is associated with greenhouse gas reductions that we've identified as an important goal for the state. But we need to try to achieve those goals in a way that that I think is that we can articulate as much flexibility as possible within those requirements. And that's why I don't like to just say we should use technology X, because I don't know what that technology is. I don't think anybody does. But market processes can help us learn about that as these technologies emerge.